Hello and welcome to Alden Carrow's Poetry Podcast. I'm Alden Carrow, poet, walker and author of Cumbr in verse, Stanza in poetry. This is a podcast for people who suspect, as I do, that the world is moving too quickly and that something quietly extraordinary waits for anyone willing to slow down, listen closely and pay proper attention to it. In every episode, I share two poems. The first is a guest poem from the wider world of verse, something that has stayed with me, or troubled me, or refused to let me go. The second is one of my own, drawn from the moors, the coasts, the weather, and the strange beauty of ordinary days. And for your chance to win a signed copy of Cumbr in verse, Stanza in poetry, I invite you to suggest a future guest poem by emailing me at aldencarrow78@gmail.com. That's aldencarrow78@gmail.com. The next guest poem will come from one of you. My email address is in the episode description. Today we are on the Solway coast, in a small working port that was never discovered so much as designed. A town laid out on a grid, its dock gates opening for exactly 2 hours around every high tide. Its whole working life timed to a rhythm it doesn't control and never will. This is an episode about a different kind of relationship with the sea than the ones we've had lately. Not loss and not dissolution, but something quieter and, I think, more useful. The question of what real mastery actually looks like when the thing you are mastering was never yours to command in the first place. We begin with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and a short, exact poem about a tide that keeps its own time regardless of who is watching. And then we come to Silloth, a town that has learned, with real precision, exactly when to open the gate. So pour something warm, settle in, the wind is up, the light is going, and there is poetry to be found. Before we come to my own poem, I want to put our theme plainly, because the whole episode turns on it. Mastery is not control, it is knowing exactly when to open the gate. We tend to think of mastery as a kind of victory, as if to master something is to finally get the upper hand over it, to bend it to our will. But there is another, older kind of mastery, and it looks nothing like victory. It looks like patience. It looks like timing. It looks like learning a rhythm so completely that you can build a whole life around it, without ever once believing you control it. Today's guest poem understands that difference exactly. It is The Tide Rises, the Tide Falls by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, published in 1880 in the last years of his life. If you know any American poetry at all, you likely know Longfellow. He was, in his own lifetime, the most famous and best-loved poet in the United States. The author of Paul Revere's Ride and the Song of Hiawatha and Evangeline, one of the group later called the Fireside Poets, whose work was read aloud in American parlours the way scripture was read in church. By the time he wrote this poem, much of that grand narrative ambition had fallen away. What was left was something plainer, and in its plainness far more powerful. The poem is built with an almost architectural discipline. 3 stanzas, 5 lines each, and every stanza opens and closes on the same unaltered refrain. The tide rises, the tide falls. Nothing about that line is permitted to change, verse after verse, no matter what has happened in between. A traveller crosses the wet sand towards the town at twilight. Darkness comes down, and the sea calls in the dark, and small waves reach up with what Longfellow calls their soft white hands and erase the traveller's footprints from the sand. Morning breaks. The horses stamp in their stalls. The day returns, but the traveller, we are told with quiet finality, does not return with it. And through all of it, unmoved by the traveller's fate, unmoved by the town waking, unmoved by grief or mourning or anything at all, the tide rises, the tide falls. Notice what Longfellow has done with his own form here, because it matters for where we are going tonight. He has written a poem about an inflexible natural rhythm, using a poem that is, itself, formally inflexible. The same 5-line shape, the same unbroken refrain, returning and returning no matter what content it is asked to carry. The form does not fight its subject, it submits to it on purpose, and that submission is exactly what makes the poem work. As I read it, listen for how little the poem asks of you, and how much it delivers precisely because of that restraint. Here is "The tide rises, the tide falls." The tide rises, the tide falls, the twilight darkens, the curlew calls. Along the sea sands damp and brown, the traveller hastens toward the town, and the tide rises, the tide falls. Darkness settles on roofs and walls, but the sea in the darkness calls. The little waves with their soft white hands efface the footprints in the sands. And the tide rises, the tide falls. The morning breaks, the steeds in their stalls stamp and neigh as the hostler calls. The day returns, but never more returns the traveller to the shore. And the tide rises, the tide falls. There is a stillness at the centre of that poem that I find, every time, quite devastating, and it comes almost entirely from what the poem refuses to do. It refuses to grieve loudly. It refuses to tell us what became of the traveller, or why he does not return, or whether anyone waits for him or misses him. It simply notes the fact, in the same flat, level voice it uses for the curlew and the horses and the hostler's call, and moves on to the next rising and falling of the tide. The sea does not pause to mark a death, if that is what has happened. It has never paused for anyone, and the poem's whole quiet power lies in refusing to pretend otherwise. But I want to draw your attention to something else, something craft-related rather than emotional, because it is going to matter a great deal for where the rest of this episode goes. Longfellow did not write a formless poem about a rhythm that cannot be formed. He did the opposite. He built the tightest possible container, a 5-line stanza, an unvarying refrain, a controlled rhyme scheme, and let the poem's meaning emerge entirely from what happens inside that fixed shape. The form is not fighting the sea for control. The form has already surrendered, the way any sensible harbour surrenders, and the poem is more powerful for it, not less. That is the exact relationship I want to bring to you now, not between a poet and the sea, but between a whole town and the sea, on the Solway coast, not far south of the border. Because if Longfellow's poem is a small, disciplined vessel built to hold an indifferent tide, the place I am about to read to you is a much larger version of precisely the same idea, built not from words, but from granite and iron and timed gates. My poem this week is called Silloth. It's a small port on the Cumbrian side of the Solway Firth, and unlike almost anywhere I've brought you this year, it was never allowed to simply grow the way old towns grow, by accident and accretion over centuries. Silloth was designed. In the middle of the 19th century, when silt enclosed the older port upstream at Port Carlisle. The railway company that needed a working harbour on this coast didn't wait for one to develop naturally. They laid out a grid. They built broad avenues and paved them with granite sets thick enough to bear the iron rims of cartwheels for 100 years. They put up timber and zinc pagoda bandstand on the green because a Victorian seaside town needed one, and Silloth, however calculated its founding, still wanted to be somewhere people would choose to walk on a summer evening. And at the heart of all that calculation sits the one thing no engineer could design away: the tide. The Solway has one of the most dramatic tidal ranges in Britain, and the dock at Silloth can only be entered or left for a narrow window either side of high water, in practice about 2 hours. Everything about the working life of that harbour is arranged around those 2 hours. The bulk carriers bringing in fertiliser and grain and perlites do not arrive when it suits them. They arrive when the tide permits them, and the gates open, and the work happens fast and precise, and then the gates close again, and the whole town waits for the sea to come back around. What struck me while walking there is that this isn't a story of decline, the way some of the other Cumbrian places I have brought you this year have been. The silos still stand. The solar panels have gone right up alongside the old molasses tanks. New technology is sitting easily beside old, because the town never stopped working. It simply learned generations ago exactly how to work within a rhythm it could never hope to change. And yet even that hard-won mastery has its limits. Down at Groom Point, where the dunes shift under the wind, the tide brings in nylon rope and salt-scoured plastic bottles along with everything else, and leaves them for someone to gather. The sea keeps its own accounts in the end, regardless of how well the harbour has learned to read the tide table. So here is my poem, Silloth. The town is pinned to the grid of a defunct railway, built when the mudflats choked Port Carlisle. Not a natural shelter, but a calculation of draft and access. Broad avenues are paved with deep-laid granite sets, sized to endure the iron rims of cartwheels, while a timber and zinc pagoda brackets the green. Here, movement is dictated by semi-diurnal tides, where the shoreline is armoured by concrete and stone revetments, the dock gates open for 2 hours around high water, a narrow window to admit the bulk cargo ships loaded with perlite, fertiliser and grain. Behind the harbour wall, silver molasses tanks and concrete silos stand beside the solar array. Expansion is halted by the limits of the salt marsh. To the north and south, the marram-bound dunes shift under the pressure of the prevailing wind. We tread the strand line at Groom Point, hauling tangled nylon and salt-scoured bottles from the tidal debris. Across the flat coastal plain, the rain falls onto a surface almost level with the sea. The water hits the cobbles of Criffel Street, seeking the lowest gradient back to the Firth. And now this brings us to our discussion for today, and it grows directly out of the harbour gates we've just been standing beside, because I think Silloth's dock is one of the best working metaphors I know for something every poet eventually has to reckon with: the difference between freedom and formlessness, and the surprising truth that constraint, properly understood, is not the enemy of good work. It is very often the thing that makes good work possible at all. Here is the instinct almost every young poet starts with, and I had it myself, that form is a cage, that rhyme, metre, the fixed shape of a sonnet, the strict architecture of a villanelle, all of it feels like a set of rules imposed on something that should, by rights, be free. Surely, the thinking goes, the truest expression is the one with no walls at all, pure, free verse, unshaped, unconstrained, following the thought wherever it wants to go. And there is real poetry to be found that way, without question. But I want to make the case this week that this instinct, however natural, gets the relationship backwards. A ship that could enter Silloth harbour whenever it liked would not be free. It would run aground on the mudflats, because the flats do not care what the ship wants. It is precisely the 2-hour window, the constraint, that makes safe passage possible at all. Take that constraint away, and you don't get more freedom. You get a wrecked ship. Poetic form works exactly the same way, and I think it's worth saying plainly to any of you working on your own poems. A sonnet's 14 lines are not there to trap the poem. They are there to force a kind of pressure and precision that endless space would never produce. When you know you have only 14 lines and a fixed rhyme scheme, and a turn that has to arrive at line 9, you stop searching for the easy, diffuse gesture and start hunting for the one exact word that will do 3 jobs at once: carry the meaning, complete the rhyme, and land the metre. That hunt is where the best lines in the language have almost always come from. Not from unlimited freedom, but from a gate that only opens for 2 hours, and the discipline of being ready when it does. You heard this principle at work before I ever named it. Longfellow's Tide poem is built from an unvarying 5-line stanza and a refrain that never once departs from itself, stanza after stanza. He did not need a looser form to say something true about an indifferent sea. He needed a tighter one, a poem shaped like the very rhythm it was describing, its structure rising and falling exactly as the tide does. The constraint was not fighting his subject. It was serving it, the way Silloth's dock gates served the harbour, rather than obstructing it. And this isn't only true of metre and rhyme, it's true of every deadline you have ever dreaded. Some episodes ago, we spoke about submitting to literary journals and about the long, patient waiting that submission demands. But I want to return to one detail of that conversation now from a different angle. A submission deadline is a dock gate. It's not an arbitrary obstacle placed between you and publication. It is the narrow window that actually forces the poem to finish. Left entirely to your own timing, with no gate ever closing, a poem can sit half-revised for years, endlessly almost ready, the way a ship with an infinitely patient harbour might simply never bother to come in. The deadline's cruelty is also its gift. It makes you decide. It makes the poem dock. I think this is worth sitting with, because it changes how you might approach the next constrained thing that lands in front of you. A competition with a strict word count, a form you never attempted, a request for a poem in exactly 12 lines. The temptation is to feel hemmed in, resentful of the limit, as though your real poem exists somewhere just beyond the boundary, and the form is keeping you from it. I would gently suggest the opposite is usually true. The boundary is where the real poem is hiding. Somewhere inside that narrow, unforgiving window, the 14 lines, the stripped metre, the 2 hours either side of high water, is a precision you would never have found if you had been given the whole tide to work with. And there is a deeper, quieter comfort in this too, one that connects back to everything the last few episodes have been circling. We have spent recent weeks in places that had lost their purpose entirely, and in a poem about a man who could not work because his hope had no object left to reach for. Silloth offers something gentler, purpose that survives, not because the sea was ever tamed, but because the town learned its rhythm so completely that working inside it became, in the end, indistinguishable from freedom. That's what real mastery looks like, not the absence of limits. The wisdom to know exactly when the gate is open, and the readiness built through years of paying close attention to be there when it is. So if you take one thing from this week's discussion into your own writing this week, let it be this. The next time a form feels like a cage, ask whether it might instead be a harbour. Ask what precision it might be quietly offering you, the way Silloth's 2-hour window offers safe passage to ships that would otherwise founder on the flats. Mastery is not control. It is knowing exactly when to open the gate and trusting that the water, rising and falling exactly as it always has, will carry you through if you are ready when it does. And now we come to the end of another walk together. We have stood with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow on a darkening shore, watching small waves erase a traveller's footprints, while the tide keeps its own unbothered time. And we've come to Silloth, a town built by calculation on the Solway coast, its whole working life timed to a gate that opens for 2 hours and no longer. 2 poems about the same indifferent rhythm, one written by a man who let his form submit to the sea, the other about a harbour that learned to work inside it, and the quiet truth that runs between them, that mastery is not control. It is knowing exactly when to open the gate. Before I go, one small thing, and I promise it will stay small, because this is not that kind of show. If these walks are becoming part of your week, the surest way not to lose them is to follow the podcast on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or wherever you happen to be listening now. It's free, it's quiet, and it means the next episode finds its own way to you every Wednesday morning without you having to remember. If the show has given you something, following it is the simplest way to make sure it keeps doing so, and it helps other quiet souls out there searching for exactly this to find their way here too. And now to our competition. If there is a poem you would like featured in a future episode, a classic, something modern, or a personal favourite you have carried with you for years, please email me at aldencarrow78@gmail.com. That's aldencarrow78@gmail.com. Every suggestion is entered into the draw for a signed copy of Cumbr in verse, Leitstafels in poetry, which I will send to you by hand. The book is also available to buy at Amazon. The next guest poem will come from one of you, and that is precisely how I want this podcast to work. Not a harbour open to everyone at once, but a gate that opens quietly and regularly for those who show up ready. So, thank you for listening, for slowing down with me, and for being willing to find, inside whatever narrow window life hands you, the precision that makes the work possible. Until next time, may you find poetry waiting for you in the everyday, and I shall speak to you again on Wednesday.